We've all been watching Russia's retreats along the front lines, the unsustainable losses, the maps shifting a few kilometers at a time, but there's a very different process unfolding right now, quieter, slower, and honestly, it might end up being more devastating than anything happening in the trenches, something that could crack the Kremlin open from the inside without a single shot being fired anywhere near Moscow. It's the railways. Russian railways, the network moving 20 to 30,000 tons of ammunition, fuel, and supplies every single day, is sitting at the epicenter of its darkest financial outlook in 16 years. Thousands of workers are staring down layoffs with almost nothing left in reserve, and multi-billion-dollar losses are wrapping around this company like ivy that doesn't let go. Russian railway workers started protesting just 2 days after a March 18th, 2026 announcement that 6,000 employees would be laid off. And today, the chaos inside this company is only getting bigger. This isn't a footnote. This is a story that could genuinely shift where this war goes next. Because if Russian railways, the single organization that functions as the heart of logistics for Putin's entire war machine, buckles under this pressure, the trajectory of this conflict changes in ways that don't show up on any frontline map. So, is Russian railways actually on the brink of collapse? Have its 700,000 workers started turning against the man who sent this country to war? Stick with me because we're going straight into the center of a crisis Moscow badly wants to keep hidden. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones underneath the headlines, hit subscribe now. Let's start at the beginning because this didn't happen overnight. The starting point for all of this was the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the wave of heavy sanctions that followed. The very rail network that once carried massive military convoys in the opening days of the war had, without anyone fully realizing it yet, already begun a slow process leading toward its own collapse. As the years passed, especially heading into 2025 and 2026, the civilian and commercial side of Russian railways business started declining at an incredible rate. The high-margin freight Russia used to export to Europe simply stopped moving. Massive coal trains, timber cars, processed steel shipments that once flowed from northwestern Russia straight to Baltic ports or directly into the heart of Europe, all of it gone. That left the entire western half of the rail network sitting idle, and it opened a massive black hole in the company's cash flow. International sanctions, closed European markets, and a sharp contraction in commodity exports like coal, metal, and oil cut through the company's main revenue streams like a blade. The war economy only wanted to fund military production. Civilian industry slowed to a crawl. And naturally, the commercial freight that used to fill those trains simply disappeared. Worse, the military shipments that replaced that commercial cargo weren't even a source of revenue for the company. They were a loss-making obligation imposed directly by the state. By 2025, Russian Railways' total freight volume had collapsed to 1.1 billion tons. That's not just a disappointing number. That's the lowest level this company has seen since 2009, the single heaviest loss ratio in 16 years. As freight dropped, revenue melted away with it. And as revenue melted, the supposedly invincible financial structure of this company started to crack in public. In 2025, under international IFRS accounting standards, the company reported a staggering 22-fold drop in profit, landing on a net profit of just 2.3 billion rubles, roughly 25 million US dollars. For a company this size, that's not a bad year. That's the most severe collapse this company has seen in recent memory, worse even than the pandemic era. And it wasn't just profits melting away. The debt sitting on this company's shoulders reached astronomical levels, approaching 4 trillion rubles, roughly 50 billion US dollars at today's exchange rate. That debt spiral forced the company to shelve every technological modernization plan, every rail renewal tender, every digitization initiative, essentially overnight. And because Russia's central bank kept jacking up interest rates to help finance the war, rolling over that mountain of debt became close to impossible. In 2025 alone, the company's financing expenses topped 534 billion rubles, roughly $7 billion, just in interest payments. Millions of rubles a day disappearing into bank interest, while out in the field, crews couldn't even find spare parts for rusted-out locomotives. So the management got desperate, and when a company this large needs to close a deficit like this, it looks for somewhere to pass the bill. First, it froze investment completely. Then it turned directly to the pockets of the people actually running the trains. As the crisis deepened, salary payments started slipping. Field crews, especially in remote regions like the Urals and Siberia, got tangled in pointless bureaucratic delays just trying to collect wages they'd already earned. Workers went unpaid for weeks, sometimes months, trying to support their families in a country where grocery prices climb every single month. The real purchasing power of railway workers fell to its lowest point in a decade. Being a railway employee in Russia used to be seen as a stable, even prestigious job. By 2026, for a lot of these workers, it had quietly turned into a poverty trap. And here's the bitter irony sitting underneath all of it. While the company couldn't find the money to pay its workers, it also couldn't find enough engineers to actually run the trains heading to the front. Training someone to independently operate one of these massive cargo trains takes months, sometimes years. You can't fix that shortage by pulling a random person in off the street. In 2024 and early 2025, Russian Railways was short exactly 2,500 engineers and 3,000 locomotive crew members. Low pay, grueling multi-week shifts, and constant stress had simply worn people down. Working inside old Soviet-era locomotives with broken heating systems in temperatures dropping to minus 30 Celsius, that's minus 22 Fahrenheit, had become straightforward physical torture. Trying to fix a stranded locomotive alone in freezing, isolated stretches of Siberia with no maintenance crew anywhere nearby had quietly shattered a lot of people's psychological endurance. So a lot of qualified railway workers left. Many transitioned into the defense industry or straight into the military, where the war economy was offering salaries this company simply couldn't match. The signing bonuses the military dangled in front of these workers were higher than what they could earn after years on the railway. Management even tried recruiting women and retirees into heavy-duty locomotive cabins, just to stop the bleeding. It didn't work. The personnel shortage got so severe that on average 200 train routes across Russia had to be canceled every single day, simply because there weren't enough engineers to run them. Trains couldn't depart. Cargo sat rotting in warehouses. Entire stations started functioning less like transportation hubs and more like scrapyards. And the clearest picture of the chaos inside this company is sitting quietly on sidings across the country. 300,000 idle railcars, almost 20% of the entire fleet, simply sitting there, rotting. The core technical reason behind that number is, again, Western sanctions. High-quality bearings used in railcar wheel sets, previously imported from Europe or America, can no longer enter the country. Domestic production can't fill that gap, so instead of properly repairing a broken car, crews strip parts off other still-functioning cars, trapping the whole system in a cannibalistic loop where it's quite literally consuming itself to stay upright. And every one of those idle cars clogging the tracks isn't just slowing down military logistics. It's strangling the company's cash flow at the same time. Eventually sitting on billions in debt, hundreds of thousands of deadweight rail cars, and a workforce that's hemorrhaging skilled people, the company found its answer in mass layoffs. First, in October 2025, head office employees were forced into 3 extra days of unpaid leave every month. Then, in March 2026, the real explosion happened. RZD's CEO, Oleg Belozerov, stood in front of cameras and officially confirmed that 15% of the company's central management and administrative staff, roughly 6,000 people, would be laid off during 2026. The plan was projected to save 74 billion rubles, roughly $1 billion, but it shattered something inside this company that isn't easily put back together. Because the fear of layoffs, layered on top of a salary crisis that had already been simmering for months, detonated a wave of anger inside a workforce of 700,000 people who had stayed quiet until now. Field personnel could see with their own eyes that executives sitting in warm offices in Moscow were making zero sacrifices of their own while pushing the entire burden down onto administrative staff and field crews, cut perks, unpaid overtime, widely circulated corruption allegations at the management level. That combination was the final straw. And these workers didn't just start turning against their own company. They started turning against the Putin administration that dragged this country into the war responsible for all of it. That's a threshold you don't often see crossed inside a regime built the way Russia's is. But in March 2026, it was crossed. In the Komi Republic, up near the edge of the Arctic Circle, workers employed by Sevzapstroy, one of Russian Railways' main construction contractors, raised the flag of a strike in the Vorkuta region. This wasn't a small, contained local dispute. It spread through the grapevine, fast, to other massive railway construction sites across the country. Local authorities and police quietly imposed an information blockade around the region, trying to keep the story from reaching national press and spreading further. The reason at the root of it all was simple: salaries that had been unpaid, delayed, or simply vanished for months. And in this part of the country, deep in the north, right at the edge of the Arctic Circle, not getting paid isn't just a financial hardship. It's a direct question of survival in freezing conditions. These workers had last been paid in December of 2025. By the end of February 2026, they hadn't seen a single ruble. And walking off the job in a strategic state-tied sector during wartime is an incredibly brave, incredibly risky move in today's Russia, one that carries the real threat of severe punishment. Strong allegations were circulating among these workers that executives at the top of the company were quietly enriching themselves off massive war budgets, that billions of rubles cycling through tenders were simply evaporating through corruption. They weren't willing to keep accepting that the cost of this war was landing entirely on the people laying the track, driving the trains, freezing in the cold, while managers inspected the same construction sites from the comfort of expensive vehicles, and the constant state messaging telling workers the country was going through hard times, that everyone just needed patience. That didn't calm anyone down. It made the anger worse. Quick pause here. If this is the kind of underneath the headline story you actually want, drop a comment and let me know, and make sure you're subscribed, because the scale of what's building here is genuinely bigger than most coverage is giving it credit for. Right now, alarm bells are genuinely starting to ring inside the Kremlin, because if Russian Railways' financial situation keeps bleeding out the way it has been, it may only be a matter of time before this small spark in Komi turns into something much bigger. These workers built this company with their own hands over years in brutal conditions, and now they're watching it melt away in front of them under the weight of a war they never chose. As the company sinks, their own futures and their children's futures are sinking with it. And this isn't isolated to one region. As of late March, similar salary delay protests have been reported in Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, and even Sverdlovsk. Workers are openly repeating a slogan now: "We won't get our salaries until the war ends." That's the first spark of a genuinely classic social explosion scenario for a regime like this one, because this 700,000-strong railway workforce is one of the most organized, most strategically essential labor pools in the entire country. And here's why this can't stay contained to just railway employees and their families. Russian Railways isn't an ordinary company. It's the steel spine holding together the largest territory on Earth. It's irreplaceable, not just for heavy industry, but for how ordinary civilians get from one city to another in a country where civil aviation is already crippled by parts embargoes on foreign aircraft. If protests spread through this workforce, if strikes multiply, and logistics genuinely grind to a halt, Russia faces a national crisis that simply cannot be patched over. Given the scale of this country, thousands of kilometers between major cities, it is mathematically, physically impossible for a truck fleet to absorb what the railways currently carry. If that scenario plays out, the picture for Russia gets genuinely bleak. Food stops reaching supermarkets, raw materials stop reaching factories, coal stops reaching thermal power plants, and entire cities face the real threat of freezing through a Siberian winter. Grain and wheat harvested in the southern regions wouldn't reach the cities that depend on it, and that alone carries the power to trigger serious food inflation. The moment the massive steel foundries beyond the Ural Mountains stop receiving coal and iron ore on schedule, their furnaces go cold, and production lines shut down. This is a chain reaction with the potential to crack every remaining pressure point holding the war economy together, one by one. But here's the thing that's actually keeping Vladimir Putin up at night. And it isn't the suffering of ordinary civilians or the slow collapse of civilian logistics. It's something much narrower and much more specific. The real nightmare sitting on his desk and the desks of his generals is the possibility that this railway crisis physically cuts off the flow of ammunition, fuel, and equipment to the front lines in Ukraine. Because of how Russia's military doctrine is structured, its army is entirely dependent on rail for heavy equipment logistics. Tanks, massive artillery pieces, thousands of tons of shells, diesel fuel, and the actual lifeblood of the army. All of it can only reach the front by rail. For decades, Russian military engineering built its entire supply chain, down to the battalion and brigade level, around specific railcar dimensions and loading platforms. Armored unit transport was custom designed around those specialized flatbed cars used to move tanks. Converting that entire system to road transport in the middle of a war isn't a strategic option. It's technically not possible. The moment this network, which handles 87% of Russia's total freight, stops moving, the army's mobility stops with it almost instantly. And most of the critical rail links feeding the front lines are single-track lines with no backup route at all. A single broken rail or a locomotive failure caused by missing spare parts can leave an entire military convoy, miles long, stranded for days. On top of that, systematic Ukrainian intelligence sabotage throughout 2025 and 2026, targeting relay cabinets, substations, and signaling systems deep inside Russia's interior, has already left these lines hanging by a thread. If engineers walk off the job, if those 300,000 idle rail cars keep clogging the paths military convoys need, if unmaintained track keeps failing under the strain, then Russian soldiers at the front become targets with nothing left to fire back with, because ammunition trains sitting immobilized at intermediate stations inside the war zone are exactly the kind of large stationary target Ukraine's long-range drones are built to hit. If Russian railways collapses, sustaining this war doesn't just get harder for Putin, it becomes a logistical dead end. And people inside the Kremlin clearly understand this because Moscow is scrambling, quietly, to pivot east toward Asia, hoping to offset this collapse in the West. Trying to escape sanctions and find refuge in the Chinese market, Moscow is clinging to its Siberian rail projects, the Trans-Siberian and BAM lines, under a modernization push called the Eastern Polygon, hoping to boost eastward coal and oil capacity and open a new economic lifeline. But the far eastern ports at the end of that line are already operating well past capacity, and they can't even find enough qualified staff to load cargo onto ships. China, fully aware of just how desperate Russia's infrastructure situation has become, is demanding heavy commercial concessions and long-term guarantees in exchange for financing any of it. And the new technology China is offering isn't even fully compatible with Russia's aging Soviet-era signaling systems. Every integration attempt keeps producing new engineering problems. And underneath all of that sits one simple, insurmountable truth. The money to build any of this, new lines, new tunnels, new bridges over permafrost that's now melting because of climate change, doubling thousands of kilometers of track through Siberia's brutal climate, that money simply isn't in the company's coffers anymore. With a $50 billion debt load and a 20% cut to its investment budget, these Siberian salvation projects have already been pushed back to 2026 and 2027. Putin's Eastern escape plan is sitting, frozen, on the exact same rusted, idle tracks as the company's 300,000 deadweight railcars. This isn't just an operational crisis anymore. It's actively destroying the system's ability to repair itself. As experienced engineers and technicians keep walking away, the people who stay get pushed into more overtime, more exhaustion, and accident and breakdown rates keep climbing as a result. Signaling failures and rail breaks reported in the first quarter of 2026 were up more than 40% compared to the same period the year before. And while civilian trains sit stranded for hours, sometimes days, because military shipments always get priority, that visible inequality is only feeding public anger further. The Kremlin's quiet panic is visible in the footage itself. Military freight cars and coal wagons sitting side by side at key stations along the Trans-Siberian line, silently revealing exactly where this regime's priorities actually sit. Local governments in Siberia try to wave off delayed civilian fuel and food shipments as temporary hiccups, but complaints spreading through closed social media groups in regions like Yakutia and Krasnoyarsk suggest this is only the tip of something much larger. Coal failing to reach thermal power plants on schedule has already raised real fears of power outages. What's actually in front of us right now isn't just a state-owned company with a wrecked balance sheet. It's the logistical heart of an entire empire, quietly tearing itself apart under the weight of its own war. A workforce rebellion, catastrophic losses, a rail network physically rotting on its own tracks. All of it steadily eating away at the Kremlin's carefully maintained image of invincibility from the inside out. So here's the real question worth sitting with. When the anger inside this 700,000-strong workforce fully detonates, will the walls of Moscow actually hold? And if Russian railways and the literal logistical heart of this entire war machine finally stops, does the end of this war for the Russian army come from a battlefield defeat at all? Or does it come from a logistical collapse that started quietly on a single strike in the Arctic and nobody in Moscow was willing to admit was happening until it was already too late to stop? If this breakdown gave you something worth thinking about, subscribe to States Report, hit the bell, and drop a comment with your take. Do you think this crisis reaches a breaking point before the war does, or does the Kremlin find a way to paper over it one more time? See you in the next one.